In the summer of 1974, in the scorching heat of the Saudi Arabian desert, two men made a deal. No press conference, no Senate vote, no public announcement, just a quiet agreement between the United States Treasury and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that would silently restructure the entire global financial order and give America a privilege no nation in history had ever possessed. For 50 years, that deal held. It funded your parents' middle-class lifestyle. It kept inflation manageable. It allowed the United States government to spend money it didn't have without the consequences that would have destroyed any other nation on earth. It made the American standard of living possible in ways that most Americans never understood, because nobody ever explained to them what was actually holding it up. In June 2024, that 50-year agreement quietly expired. It was not renewed. And the consequences of that quiet non-renewal are already moving through the global financial system, heading directly toward your checking account, your 401k, and the purchasing power of every dollar you have ever saved. This is the story of the deal that built the American empire, and what happens now that it's over. Part 1. The illusion of wealth. Most Americans believe that dollar is valuable because the United States has a strong economy, because of American innovation, American military power, American institutions. These things matter. But they are not the primary reason the dollar has functioned as the world's reserve currency for the last 50 years. The primary reason is oil. Here is the mechanism that most Americans were never taught in school. In 1971, President Nixon made a decision that should have been catastrophic for the dollar. He ended the convertibility of the dollar into gold, essentially telling the world that the promise underpinning every dollar in existence, the promise that a dollar could be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold, was no longer valid. The dollar was now backed by nothing tangible, just the promise of the United States government. By any conventional economic logic, this should have triggered a collapse in global confidence in the dollar. Nations holding dollar reserves should have dumped them. The dollar's status as the world's reserve currency should have ended. It didn't, because 3 years later, in that quiet meeting in the Saudi desert, the United States constructed a replacement system. The deal was straightforward. Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil producer and the de facto leader of OPEC, would price its oil exclusively in US dollars. Every nation on earth that wanted to buy Saudi oil would need to acquire dollars first. In exchange, the United States would provide Saudi Arabia with military protection and security guarantees. The implications were immediate and profound. Oil is not optional. Every economy on earth runs on energy. Every nation that wanted to industrialize, to heat its homes, to fuel its vehicles, to run its factories, needed oil. And now, to buy oil, they needed dollars. This created a permanent, structural global demand for U.S. currency that had nothing to do with American economic performance and everything to do with this single geopolitical arrangement. Nations around the world accumulated dollar reserves not because they particularly wanted dollars, but because they needed dollars to participate in the global energy market. Those dollars were predominantly recycled into U.S. Treasury bonds, essentially loans to the American government. This meant the United States could borrow money at lower interest rates than any other nation on earth. It could run trade deficits, importing more than it exported, for decades without the currency crisis that would have devastated any other country. It could fund its military, its welfare state, its infrastructure, and its tax cuts simultaneously, financing the difference by selling treasury bonds to the world that needed dollars to buy oil. Your 401k grew in an economy partially subsidized by this arrangement. The mortgage rate on your house was lower because of this arrangement. The prices at Walmart were kept manageable because of this arrangement. The American standard of living for 50 years was not solely the product of American productivity. It was partially the product of a geopolitical monopoly on the world's most essential commodity. That monopoly is ending. Part 2. The betrayal. The cracks have been visible for years to anyone watching closely. In 2009, China and Russia quietly began bilateral trade agreements, allowing them to settle transactions in their own currencies, bypassing the dollar entirely. At the time, this was a minor footnote in financial news. The dollar system seemed too entrenched, too institutionally embedded to be seriously challenged. The footsteps have gotten louder since then. In 2022, Russia was cut off from the SWIFT international payment system following its invasion of Ukraine. The intention was to cripple the Russian economy by blocking its access to dollar-denominated transactions. The effect was real and damaging, but it also demonstrated to every nation on earth that the United States could, at will, use the dollar's reserve status as a weapon, and that any country that crossed Washington's interests could be excluded from the global financial system overnight. For nations that had always harbored concerns about American foreign policy, this demonstration was a clarifying moment. If the dollar could be weaponized against Russia today, it could be weaponized against anyone tomorrow. The response was accelerated de-dollarization. the deliberate reduction of dollar dependence in international trade and reserves. China and Saudi Arabia began negotiating oil sales settled in Chinese yuan, the petro-yuan, a direct challenge to the foundational arrangement of the petrodollar system. Brazil and Argentina began exploring bilateral trade in local currencies. India began purchasing Russian oil in rupees. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, expanded their membership and began explicit discussions about creating an alternative reserve currency or payment system that would reduce dependence on the dollar. And then, in June 2024, the 50-year security pact between the United States and Saudi Arabia quietly expired. It was not renewed on the original terms. Saudi Arabia, which had been the linchpin of the petrodollar arrangement since 1974, was publicly exploring oil sales in currencies other than the dollar. The kingdom that had made the deal that built the modern dollar system was no longer committed to maintaining it exclusively. Meanwhile, central banks around the world were buying gold at the fastest pace since the 1960s. In 2022 and 2023, central bank gold purchases hit record levels. The nations doing the buying were not primarily Western democracies. They were the emerging economies: China, India, Turkey, Poland, Singapore, nations that were quietly repositioning their reserves away from dollar-denominated assets and toward the one asset that cannot be weaponized, frozen, or devalued by any foreign government's decision. Gold does not require trust in any institution. It cannot be sanctioned. It cannot be printed. It does not depend on the continued functioning of any payment system. The nations leaving the dollar system are not doing so loudly. They are doing so with the quiet, deliberate patience of institutions that understand that the transition, if managed carefully, can be navigated without triggering the panic that a sudden exit would produce. But the direction is clear, and the destination, for the dollar's reserve status, is somewhere significantly diminished from where it has been for the last 50 years. Part 3, the domino effect on your wallet. Here's where macroeconomic geopolitics stops being abstract and becomes personal. The petrodollar system, for 50 years, required the world to hold dollars. Nations accumulated dollar reserves. They parked those reserves in U.S. Treasury bonds. This created a massive, sustained, artificial demand for American debt, keeping U.S. interest rates lower than they would otherwise have been, and keeping the dollar stronger than it would otherwise have been. Now imagine that demand declining, not collapsing overnight. The system is too large and too institutionally embedded for that, but declining consistently over years and decades. As nations reduce their dollar reserves, they sell treasuries. As treasury selling increases, prices fall and yields rise, meaning the United States government has to pay higher interest rates to borrow money. Higher interest rates flow through to mortgages, car loans, business financing, and credit cards. The cost of debt in America rises. As dollar demand declines globally, the purchasing power of the dollar falls relative to other currencies and relative to the goods Americans import. The United States imports an enormous quantity of goods: electronics, clothing, medications, components for manufacturing. As the dollar weakens, those imports cost more. Those costs are passed to consumers. And here's the dynamic that should concern every American with a savings account. The dollars that have been held overseas for 50 years, parked in foreign central bank reserves, recycled into treasury bonds, sitting in the accounts of oil-exporting nations, don't simply disappear when those nations diversify away from dollar holdings. They return. When a foreign central bank sells its treasury bonds and converts the proceeds into gold or yuan or euros, those dollars don't vanish from existence. They re-enter the global financial system. Eventually, they find their way back to the United States economy. More dollars chasing American goods and services. Prices rise. Purchasing power falls. This is the inflationary mechanism that most economists who discuss dollar reserve status decline to explain in terms that connect to ordinary American financial lives. Your savings account is denominated in dollars. If the dollar's purchasing power declines, if the goods and services that a dollar buys today cost more dollars tomorrow, your savings are being eroded not by any decision you made, not by any investment that went wrong, but by a geopolitical transition happening in rooms you will never enter, decided by people you will never meet. The 50-year subsidy that kept American living standards elevated is being withdrawn, not all at once, but consistently. And the purchasing power cost of that withdrawal will be distributed across the entire American economy, falling most heavily on the people who hold the most dollars with the fewest alternatives. That is middle-class America, the people with 401ks and savings accounts and fixed incomes, the people whose wealth is denominated primarily in the currency that is losing its structural advantage. Part 4. The wealth transfer. The elites know this. The people managing billion-dollar portfolios, the sovereign wealth funds, the family offices of the ultra-wealthy, they read the same signals, they understand the direction, and they are not sitting in savings accounts. On the flight to hard assets, to gold, to real estate in stable jurisdictions, to commodity-producing businesses, to assets whose value is not denominated in any single currency, has been accelerating among sophisticated investors for years. Warren Buffett has been accumulating cash and reducing equity exposure. Hedge funds have been building commodity positions. Billionaires have been buying farmland, the asset that produces physical necessities regardless of what currencies do. Central banks are buying gold. Sovereign wealth funds are diversifying into real assets. The institutions with the most sophisticated understanding of the transition underway are positioning themselves in assets that hold value across currency regime changes. This is the pattern that history repeats in every significant monetary transition. When the British pound lost its reserve currency status after World War II, the wealth that was held in pound-denominated assets was eroded. The wealth held in gold, in American assets, and productive real estate survived and compounded. The transition from one reserve currency system to another does not destroy wealth. It transfers it from those holding the declining currency to those holding the assets that retain value through the transition. The question for every American watching this is not whether the transition is happening. The evidence that it is underway is in the public record, in central bank gold purchases, in BRICS expansion, in the Saudi pivot, in the quiet non-renewal of a 50-year pact. The question is where your wealth is positioned as the transition unfolds. In 1974, in the Saudi desert, a deal was made that most Americans never knew about. For 50 years, it subsidized the American standard of living, funded the American government's borrowing, and kept the dollar at the center of the global financial system. In 2024, it quietly ended. The consequences will not arrive as a single dramatic event. They will arrive as persistent inflation that doesn't behave the way the Fed says it should, as interest rates that stay higher than the models predict, as a purchasing power that declines a little more each year than the official numbers capture. The 50-year secret kept America rich. Its ending will not keep you that way. In central bank gold purchases, in BRICS expansion, in the Saudi pivot, in the quiet non-renewal of a 50-year pact. Unless you understand what is happening and why. Subscribe to Economic Chronicles. Stay awake in a sleeping world.